Hello, Colorado Realtors. I'm Scott Peterson. Thank you for joining me for another edition of Legal Bites. Well, here we are in the first week of February 2021. January flew by. I don't know what happened to it. So much so that I didn't record a single Legal Bites in the month of January, which is probably a good thing for you guys who get a little bit tired of hearing and seeing me on these things. But moreover, in the sort of COVID world and stuff that we've been dealing with, we've seen a real sort of consistency and flatness in moving from the color dials from red back primarily to orange, and even some yellow and lesser restrictive areas in some counties around the state. But the good news is it's been very, very flat. So that's as much COVID as I'm going to give you today. I did want to come here and talk to you about appraisal matching clauses, though, as sort of a new topic. And this isn't a new topic in the sense that appraisal matching clauses have been around for years, and Colorado has been experiencing a real high volume and high velocity market. And anytime we end up in a high volume, high velocity market, you have buyers, particularly when you've got such low inventory as we've had. You've had a lot of buyers that are competing for multiple offers or in multiple offer situations, and they're doing things or asking you as their buyer's agents to do things that are abnormal, potentially risky, and escalation clauses, appraisal clauses. But one of the things that I've noticed on the hotline over the last, I would say, 6 weeks to maybe 8 weeks, has been some calls that demonstrate to me that there's some confusion about how these appraisal clauses actually work, and they're often a little bit one-sided. So just as a preliminary starting point, anytime that you as a broker at the instruction of your client are drafting these clauses that might be abnormal or in the interest of being more and more competitive or writing a better offer, more sexy offer for your buyer that might have a higher likelihood of getting accepted by the seller, you got to be very, very careful in terms of your drafting. You've got to make sure that your client understands it, whether it's the buyer who's writing the clause or the seller who's presumably accepting the contract with the clause in it. Parties have to understand it, and you've got to make sure in drafting it that what you're communicating, keep it simple, stupid is the KISS principle. Don't overcomplicate it, don't over-lawyer it. Make sure that it does, though, accomplish what the parties are trying to accomplish. Because specifically with regard to the appraisal clause, those are most typically just a one-sided obligation. And it has created a lot of new questions. So let's have a look at kind of a basis for writing an appraisal clause and how that might work out. So a purchase price, just as an example, is $400,000. And then the buyer writes an offer that says, hey, maybe we know we're overpaying a little bit, or there's a chance this property won't appraise, but we're going to pay above list or whatever that might be. So they write a clause in that says, hey, the buyer is willing to bring, if the property doesn't appraise, an additional $10,000 or up to an additional $10,000 to closing in order to bridge any gap between the purchase price and presumably a lower appraisal. Now, obviously, as a buyer's agent, you've got to make sure you're putting a cap on what that additional money is. If you just say they'll bring any additional money between the appraisal and the purchase price, well, you could have a really bad or inconsistent or surprisingly low appraisal that could really, really expose your buyers on the back end there to actually bring a lot more money than they are capable and willing to bring. And also, you've got to make sure that when you are capping it, as you need to do every time, that whatever you're capping at, your buyers understand that they're going to be obligated to bring that additional money. And so as part of the kind of considerations of good faith and making consistent representations to the seller, they've got to be capable of coming up with that additional $10,000 or $5,000 or whatever that cap is. As a worst case scenario, they're going to have to be able to make sure they can perform. But let's say you've got a $400,000 purchase price. You've got a clause that says the buyer is going to bring up to an additional 10. Well, if the property appraises at, let's say, $393,000, it works well here. The buyer, in this case, has committed contractually well before the appraisal, because remember, this is going to be at the time of the contract. In this case, they're going to bring an additional $7,000 to the closing table to bridge that gap that has been created by the low appraisal. No problems there. Don't have much confusion about that. In how these appraisal clauses actually play out. But let's just say, as an example now, that the property appraises at $385,000. So we've got actually a $15,000 shortfall. and between the appraisal and the purchase price, but a $10,000 cap. Now, this is where we get into some issues and confusion that I'm seeing more and more commonly on the hotline, and that is a buyer's agent who will call and ask or be confused because they were surprised when the listing agent essentially said, well, my seller is not going to take $395 in this example. In other words, it's a one-sided clause, so the obligation is on the buyer to bring an additional $10,000 or up to an additional $10,000, but the obligation is not on the seller to lower the purchase price even by 1 penny. So in my example here, sure, the buyer might be obligated to come to the closing table with $395,000, but the clause as they're most commonly written does not obligate the seller to do an amend extend or to in any way reduce the purchase price by $5,000. In other words, come down to the appraised value plus the $10,000 the buyer is obligated to bring. And so that disconnect is super important for you as a buyer's agent to make sure your buyers understand how those clauses work. And they're not two-sided in most cases. Now, that same clause could add an additional sentence or two that might obligate the seller to revise the purchase price to appraised value plus $10,000. Or it could say that the purchase price shall be changed to the appraised value plus $10,000. So there's ways that at the time of contract, you can make that clause a mutual obligation. In other words, it's not just the buyer's obligation to bring the additional money, it's the seller's obligation to actually acknowledge or revise the purchase price down to meet that particularly low appraisal situation. So keep that in mind as you're working with your buyers and make sure you're setting their expectations. Because I got to tell you, I've had just a handful of these calls lately where I feel bad because the buyer's agent's got to basically go back to their buyer and go, well, I didn't exactly explain this to you right because the seller actually doesn't have to budge or reduce the purchase price based on a shortfall in the appraisal that was even below the additional money you were going to bring. So be thinking about those things, thinking about the concepts of good faith, bad faith, in terms of making offers and actually the buyer being able to bring that money. You can't just be inducing a seller to contract with you if you're not actually capable of performing what you're committing to on the back end. So that could lead to other incidents of earnest money forfeiture for the buyer and things along those lines. So do be cautious as you're messing around with these clauses. Make sure they're drafted right. Make sure your party's expectations are set on both ends. And make sure that if you're a seller and you're receiving an offer, that and for some reason there is the additional language that obligates them to potentially reduce that purchase price, make sure as a listing broker you're very clear with your seller that it's a two-sided commitment that the buyer and seller are making rather than just a one-sided commitment, which is how they are, like I say, most commonly drafted. So be mindful of all of that. Keep making hay while the sun shines out there, guys. I know the market is fantastic and super busy. If you have questions about this or any other topics, Car Legal Hotline is available from 9 to 12 and 1 to 4, Monday through Friday, and we always love hearing from you there. Take care, guys, and we'll see you soon on another edition of Legal Bites.